actually assess the reliability of studies and how actually we can contribute in this particular arena of peer reviewing and as an author. So before we start, may I take this wonderful opportunity to introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Vinay Chugh. He is currently working as additional professor and unit in charge orthodontics, Department of Dentistry at AIMS Jodhpur. He did his MDS in orthodontics from King George's Medical College, Lucknow. He has also completed his M.Orth from Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, UK. He did his fellowship in advanced orthodontics from University of Connecticut Health Center, USA. He is a recipient of Young Orthodontist Award from CRA and SS Sidhu Award from NAMS. We are privileged to have such a wonderful person with so many accolades with us today, and we are eager to learn a lot of things about assessing the reliability of studies from you, Dr. Vinay Chugh. Please welcome Dr. Vinay. And now the court is in your ball is in your court, so please take over.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for a warm introduction. Am I audible?
Yes.
At the outset, I would like to thank Divya ma'am for giving me this opportunity. When I chose this topic, I was a little reluctant, but when I went deeper into this topic, I find it really very interesting. And I must use this disclaimer that I am not a statistician, and some things will be pertaining to deeper core of statistics in these presentations. So anyone who is better known about this subject, he or she can add towards the end of these presentations. And I will try to make some sense from these presentations to how to look at the reliability of these studies. Okay, just few terminologies when we dig deep into this topic. Whenever why do we assess reliability first? First, we should know why we assess reliability. Whenever any measurement is in a given sample is repeated twice, either by two different observers or by the same observer, we cannot have the same set of measurements. There will be some or small error in that, and which will lead to different readings at the two occasions or at the two measurements. So what are these small errors we call? There can be two types of error. One can be random error and one can be a systematic error. So random error is quite unavoidable and very unpredictable because, for example, whenever we are measuring our weight or whenever we are measuring our height, our posture can be little different and the values may vary in few grams, but there may be some change. So that is quite unpredictable and quite unavoidable. And similarly, if we are looking some beaker in a liquid, and if you're looking at from different levels or different angulations, some variation might be there in the measurement of that volume of that liquid. They are called as random errors. And what are systemic errors? Systemic errors pertains to calibrations. If any device or equipment we are using to measure our measurements, so that device should be properly calibrated. And second calibration is at the level of the examiners. The examiners should also be calibrated. They should be well versed with the technique before they are going to make measurements. We'll come across these terminologies again. And whatever may be the cause of these errors or difference in two measurements, we will need to measure the precision. Now we come to precision. Now we have to define two more terms to get deep. One is accuracy, one is precision. If you look at this famous example, the bullseye, if you look that the arrows are in the center. So arrows in the center and they are clustered around one point. So this diagram pertains to say that this is having a high precision. Why I say high precision? Because all the arrows or all the darts are at one clustered around one point. And is it highly accurate? Yes, this is highly accurate because this is what we are intended to do. So accuracy and precision in general English term means both are synonymous to each other, but in statistics they are quite different from each other. So if you look at the next picture, here you can see all the darts are clustered together at one position, but they are not at the center. So the accuracy becomes low, but the precision is still high. And if you look at the third diagram, you see that the darts are clustered around the center. So they still has a high validity, but they are scattered. So they are no more reliable now. No more, the precision is weak. And in the last example, all of them are not clustered around the one end and not at the center. So they have low accuracy, low. So these are just general terms. Accuracy pertains to validity, while precision pertains to reliability in statistics. Now two more terminologies: repeatability and reproducibility. What is repeatability? Whenever a single observer, we have to simply think in terms of, if a single observer is measuring or repeating his measurements after a certain period of time, let's say after 2 weeks or 4 weeks, then it is repeatability. And if we want to reproduce something, that means there are two observers. Reproducibility is generally used when there are two observers. So whenever one observer makes a measurement, other observer also have to make the same measurements again. So that term is usually used as reproducibility. But in the literature, you will come across reliability, intra-observer. Sometimes it will be written reproducibility, sometimes it will be written as repeatability. But in general, if you look at repeatability and reproducibility are parts of the reliability. So you will come across these terminologies: intra-observer, inter-observer, intra-rater, inter-rater. They may be used interchangeably: reliability, reproducibility, or repeatability. But when I say repeatability, it means intra-observer or intra-rater or intra-examiner. And when I say reproducibility, it means inter. There are two persons are involved in that measurement. And what should we measure? Whether we should measure intra-observer or inter-observer. If we should measure minimal, we should measure intra-observer. That is, if I am the one of the rater or measurement observer, then I should measure twice my measurement to see that my measurements are reliable enough that other person can use it. And ideally, we should do both inter and intra. Now, one more term: standard error of measurement. What is standard error? Standard error is just how much we are deviating, how much is the observed value differed from the true value. So standard error should also be a part of the reporting whenever we are reporting the reliability. Now, there are so many tests of reliabilities: paired t-test, Pearson correlation, independent t-test, Cohen's kappa, Cronbach alpha, Bland-Altman, intra. We'll come to all three, but the tests on the left sides, they have earlier, when these techniques were not developed, or what you see on the right side, people have used this paired t-test, independent t-test, or still some people use paired t-test or Pearson correlation coefficient. But from statistical point of view, for reliability testing, this paired t-test and Pearson correlation coefficient should not be used. Why? Actually, the paired t-test examine if the mean difference between two correlated data could be 0 or not. If there is a large variability, then the results could be different. If there is a small variability, then the p-value could be significant. So for p-value is actually not a good measurement for reliability. And even if some studies report that it is measured by p, then you should look that they should be supplemented by additional methods of reliability testing, such as Bland-Altman or ICC testing. So I'm just quoting one of the examples. I came across these studies. See, the title of this study is reliability. So when you see this title, that means you should look for you have the core methods of reliability testing. First, they should look for intra and inter-observer. Whenever any whenever any paper has mention of reliability in its title, then means they ought to report inter-observer or intra-observer reliability. They cannot simply report only one reliability. They report both the reliabilities. And if you look at this, then I'm reading this, the study was undertaken to assess the reliability of the Android smartphone based and manual. So there are two methods. They are trying to assess the two methods. So now if we are using intra-observer reliability, then both the methods should separately have if there are two observers, so one observer should have measure this with one method, then with another method, and similarly there are two observers, then the two observers should also measure each other's, and then after some time also. So we should have all these things. But when I look at the data, they simply present just the pair t-test, independent t-test, just manual and so how it is different from the conventional descriptive statistics? So it is same. So that means this way of assessing the reliability is wrong. Apart from this data where they are reporting just the mean standard error, other than this, there is no reliability test is being used. So this is not a correct way of reporting reliability. Another paper I went through, they are testing two methods. And when I go through this method, they are reporting just means and then using t-test. So t-test is not a good way of using testing reliability. And then some test studies also report Pearson correlation coefficient. They are reporting, and because this Pearson correlation coefficient extension is intra-class correlation coefficient, which is used for reliability. So some studies are using, but Pearson correlation coefficient is, they can tell us about the association. And primarily, if whenever we have used correlation, we are testing the association of two variables. We are not measuring the proximity of the two variables, because for reliability, the proximity of the two variables should be there. And they are measuring the strength of a linear association, not an agreement. So Pearson correlation coefficient should also not be used for reliability testing. So coming across to this paper, see, this is a recent paper published, and when I was going through this paper, I was looking, and they have reported the Pearson correlation coefficient for. Ideally, this is not the correct way, and we're planning to write a letter to the editor because it is just a recently published paper. If you want to report the reliability, they have reported this intra-examiner error. They have, but they fail to produce the inter-examiner error as well. So if you are reporting reliability, both inter and intra-examiner, and then the correct version of measurement should be used. Now the classic ICC. Now our ICC is a variance of it is developed from Pearson correlation coefficient, but it is not same as that because it is based on ANOVA testing. It refers to correlation with a class of data rather than to the correlation between two different classes of data. Like in correlation coefficient R, we are measuring association of two variables. Here their variable is one only. So, and ICC serves as a quantitative estimate. When I say quantitative estimate, I am saying that it is only for the numerical data. Numerical data is where you have means, like you can measure that, like age, hair, weight, hair, length, weight, whether you can measure them, that is measurable. And when you have another set of data that is categorical data, then this should not be used. ICC is used only for the numerical data. And ICC is a measure of reliability coefficient. ICC is measured in terms of intra-class correlation coefficient or reliability. And it is based on analysis of variance. That is why it's formalized true variance upon total variance. And ICC have intra-class correlation coefficients have different models. They have been extensively studied in the literature. But whatever gist, I will just give you gist of three models which are most commonly used. So there are two types of model: one-way model, one-way random effects model, and then there are two-way models. So when to use one way, when to use two-way. So when to use one way is rarely used in clinical. I mean to say is that one way is rarely used is because it is based because only one of the rater, one or each subject is rated by different set of judges. So the data is not judged by the same set of raters. And this is primarily used in multicentric studies. So we don't want to know much about this, because it is only applicable in multicentric data. So one-way random effect model. Second method is two-way random effect model. Here there are set of raters who are randomly selected from a large population. Raters are selected. Raters who will measure. The raters are selected, and the subjects will also be rendered. But there will be rating the same number of subjects as opposed to the one-way random model, right? And this is primarily used for inter-rater reliability when you are measuring the inter-rater weight, that is between two examiners. So whenever you read what kind of statistics is being used, if ICC is being used, you will have to look at the two-way random effect model or one-way and random effect model. And the third is the two-way mixed effect model. So you will have to look for the third. It is primarily used for intra-observer reliability, because here raters are not selected from the generalized population. Like if I am doing my thesis, so only I am measuring it. So as a rater, I am fixed. So that is why this model is used for intra-observer reliability. Less commonly it is used for inter-rater reliability. When I say selected from large population, means the data, whatever I am measuring it has to have a generalizability. So, but in ICC3 model, generalizability is not there because the raters are inexperienced. If both the raters are 10 years experience, 15 years experience, then they can be used in ICC2 model rather than the ICC3 model. So there is one flow chart. I am not going into the details of this flow chart, but just quickly go through one or two examples. So what is reliability? Here you can see the reporter, it has been reported as inter-rater and inter-rater, and some ICC values are there. So they are measuring reliability and agreement of 3 devices of implant stability. So you can see that the ICC values are there, and ICC value rates from 0 to 1. So for inter-rater it is separate, and for inter-rater it is separate. What is this poor, good, moderate? So ICC values, you generally below, if it is below 0.5, then it is considered as poor. And if it is 0.5 to 0.75, then it is moderate, 0.75 to 0.9, good, and 0.9. So generally, if you have a good reliability among two measurements, so you will have the ICC value as more than 0.9, and 0.9 it is considered as excellent. But below 0.6, if you want to generalize it, you will not be able, and your method will not be replicable by other. So it is not considered good. Now, how to report ICC? So when you go through the papers which have come for review, so you look for the software information, because what software they are using, and then the model, like I discussed, model ICC 1, 2, 3, and then the type. Type is means if there is a single rater, it will be labeled as 1, and if we are using average of 3 measurements, then it will be rated as 2. And definition is last is because it also divides into consistency and absolute agreement. I'm again not going into detail because it is hardcore statistics. So in 3 terms, model, then type, rater, single rater, or absolute or consistency. So it is important to evaluate whether the author have used the correct form of ICC or not. So you can always ask question, and along with that 95% confidence interval should also be reported. Then another method is Bland-Altman plot. It is simple graphical method. ICC is like you have a tables and all. In Bland-Altman, you can simply look at the graphs and can tell that whether this method is agreeable or not. It is just based on the visualization method. What they use is one is the mean difference, and on the another they use as mean. So mean difference means mean difference between the two values. Like for if I'm doing for two methods, then they are on y-axis they are plotting mean difference, and on x-axis then they are plotting as average of mean. If a gold standard method is being compared, then only one mean can be used. And what is this graph telling us? So this is just telling us that 0 is the line where is 0, where there is no difference, and it is above 0. That means this red line is telling us the mean difference line, and the data is scattered between 2 standard deviations. Data is scattered between 2 standard, and if it is between 2 standard deviations, then the level of agreement is considered as good. This is the in this case, if you see, this is the line of 0 where there is no difference. Now this red line indicates mean difference. That means this is the bias which is there between the two measurements, but it again falls into 2 standard deviation. All these measurements are mostly falling, so that means the level of agreement is fine with this. So this is Bland-Altman. Again, it is used for the numerical data. Now coming on to the categorical data. So you here see the 2 types of data are there in categorical. One is nominal, one is ordinal. So nominal is just like binary outcomes where you have yes, no answer, male, female answer. And ordinal is when you see so many index, like this is a commonly used Payne scale. So this is ordinal scale. So for the categorical data can be used for differently for different tests. So One crude method is simple. You can calculate, you just have 5 patients, rate it, give him some grading of 6, 4, 3. This we usually do whenever we are given in any functions or we are made judge, we just simply scroll them. So this is by just by agreement of percentages, that 60% reliability is there between the two judges. So this is just a crude method which should not be used. Another method is Cohen-Kappa statistics. Kappa statistics is such a measure of inter-rater agreement that the categorical scales are used. Whenever two binary outcomes, again I said that yes or no is when the answer is between yes or no, then this kappa statistic is being used. Then Cohen kappa, often simply called as kappa, is a measure of agreement between two individuals. So for example, there is a referral for cancer screening from a primary health center. Two experienced doctors are rating this. So the outcome is that they have to refer or not to refer. Now this is a binary outcome, refer, not to refer. So for 5 patients, so then you will calculate normal Cohen-Kappa statistics. It's a binary outcome. For ordinal, the kappa, there is a variation of kappa, that is the weighted kappa that is used. So Cohen-Kappa can be used for, usually when kappa was introduced, it was originally introduced for methods. Whenever you were testing the reliability of two methods, and later on it was used for inter-rater reliability as well, and can be used, and it is more robust than the normal crude percentage method. So how kappa coefficient, similarly similar to 0 to 1 of ICC, it also have values ranging from 0 to 1, and 0.8 to 1 is considered as very good agreement. So this is kappa coefficient, and weighted kappa can be used for the ordinal variables, and there is again light kappa. So this is based on the how many raters. If the raters increase, the method of the kappa can change, but this is primarily used for categorical variables. To summarize, I would say that whenever you have a categorical or nominal data, you use simple Cohen's data and you have two raters, and when you have more than two, then you use Fleece kappa. And whenever you have ordinal data, that is your indices are primarily used for that. So then you have two raters, then you ordinal weighted. This is classically weighted kappa. You will read so many times whenever the indices are being rated by two. If it is being rated by more than 2, then you will use Fleece kappa. And for continuous or your numerical data, you use intra-class correlation coefficient or Bland-Altman plot with limits. This is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take few questions.
Thank you, Dr. Vinay, and it was a wonderful presentation. There are a couple of questions. If we can take it, I think the time is allowing for a couple of questions. So the first question was that when we use the Z-test.
Okay. Z-test is actually a measure of that is a Fisher exact test. Z-test is a Fisher exact test that is measured for the. It is also measured for the used for the categorical data only, but this is not related to reliability. That is for whenever you are comparing percentages, whenever you want to compare the significance of percentages of two groups, then you are using that Fisher exact test or Z-test. It is not used for reliability testing.
One of the question asked by Dr. S. Sirisha is that as a reviewer, do we need to check that right statistical analysis has been done, or is it the duty of journal editorial team?
No, because the editor is not the authenticity of the paper, and he has looked into that the paper is in good form and it can be sent for review. The primary responsibility lies within the reviewer only to check for the correct statistic, because we had in the past had an experience of one paper reporting the wrong statistics, and then someone else wrote to the editor that this is not how you interpret the data, and then the editors, although reviewer assessed that paper, then the editors went back to that paper and then they reanalyzed those data, and then that paper was retracted. So it is primarily the responsibility of the reviews to look at the statistical data.
One question has been asked by Dr. Varsha. If the grading systems are compared, for example, grading system for maxillary sinus disease is it a reliability studies, or is kappa coefficient in RSM a reliability test?
See,
I think they mean to say that, yeah.
see, one important thing we have to understand is there are, whenever a new methods or whenever there are 2-3 methods for measuring the same outcome, then there are reliability studies are performed. But whenever we are actually performing any experiment, so we need to perform for any, whenever there are measurements associated with it, so we need to perform the reliability testing. And whenever it is simple, if we are performing any reliability testing, whether it is a reliability study or not, that is a that does not matter. If we are doing some measurements, the reliability of that measurement should be there, and both ideally both inter and intra should be reported, but at least minimal intra observer reliability should be. And when you are testing a reliability, and you have to see the data, whether data is your numerical data or whether data is categorical. If the data is numerical, you use ICC or Bland-Altman. If data is categorical, you use the kappa statistics.
One last question is there, sir, from Dr. Sujal. I think she has been referring to the one of the concepts that you mentioned, that in one of the orthodontic journals you found a mistake. She's also referring that how such common mistake in applying a statistical test can rectify. Article was published in Engel Orthodontic Journal, renowned in the field of orthodontics. And should we write an editorial letter in this case?
Yes, I am planning to. When I was preparing for this topic, I came across this article and I have almost written a letter to the editor. I have not sent it though, but I have written to it whether this Pearson correlation coefficient testing, because in the past few books, we should not be, because statistics is an ever evolving science. In the past few books, I've also mentioned that Pearson correlation coefficient can be used. But of late, when newer methods have come and which have more reliability and have been standardly reported, then these methods should not be used. But we can write a letter and maybe the authors can explain, and if it is well, then maybe the paper remains in. And sometimes if the editor don't agree with the reply of the author, then he has the prerogative of retracting that article as well. Yes, I agree that this is one of the reputed journal.
I completely agree with you that there might be many different perspectives to see our same thing from the statistical point of view. And while we write a letter to an editor pointing, it's not that we want to point out a mistake. It's enriching the whole medical community that this something is lacking, and that could have been done in a better way. And I think authors always take it in a good perspective if the mistake is told in such a manner that also helps them to evolve and grow in their own field. So I think you are quite right in this thing.
And sometimes the part data is presented in the paper. Maybe the authors may have calculated, and then are based on their experience or their statistics, they might have published this. So maybe so we are not aware of the other side of the story. So probably just writing to them, we are not telling them to retract. We're just asking clarification why the Pearson correlation coefficient was used in this article.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinay, for a wonderful presentation on the reliability of studies, and it was wonderful listening to you. And now I take the privilege to invite our another speaker, second speaker for today, who is going to speak on a fantastic topic, reviewing the basic manuscript statistics. I welcome Dr. Surjit Singh. Sir, you would be pleased to know that for the last 4 days in all the webinars, we have been discussing whether it is the real duty of peer reviewer or not, because I think most of the dentists are not officially trained in biostatistics, and that's why they try to shirk from this major responsibility. Before we start the webinar, may I take the opportunity to introduce your kind self to the audience. Dr. Surjit Singh is currently working as additional professor at AIIMS Jodhpur. He did his graduation from Maulana Azad Medical College, New Delhi. He did his MD in pharmacology and DM in clinical pharmacology from PGI MER Chandigarh in 2012. He was working as principal scientist and conducted phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials in Zydus Cadila. He is also BLS and ACLS instructor, has around 45 publications which include original research and meta-analysis in national and international journals of repute. His passion includes teaching and clinical research, which can contribute to patient care in long term. A wonderful person with so much of accolades in his career. please welcome Dr. Surjit Singh on this wonderful topic, whether how to review and when to review basic statistics in a journal. Dr. Surjit Singh, over to you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. I'm thankful to Dr. Divya and her team members for giving me this opportunity to talk on reviewing the basic manuscript statistics. Although I agree with you, sir, that not everybody is expert in statistics, but as the paper comes to us for review, it is our duty to be doubly sure that statistics is perfect and the appropriate statistical test has been applied, and misinterpretation or false or wrong test should not have been applied with regard to statistics. Because I will at the end of my presentation I will show you an example how a wrong interpretation have led to a real blunder in history. So starting my presentation. So errors, with regard to errors, so in a manuscript there can be many errors. Errors can be with regard to the data, with regard to data management, statistical analysis, logic, as well as communication. So there can be many errors. So in this particular presentation, I will talk about statistical analysis error, but I will give you a line or two about with regard to data errors and data management errors, logic and communication. So as we can see that there can be a bad data which can be generated from low quality collection methods or the study design or sampling techniques. For example, observational studies or the studies which are not robustly conducted, they generate a poor quality data. And if we use a poor quality data and we are in a situation that we are going to get bad results. The significant results we get from a low quality data are basically not good for scientific community. So our data generation technique should be appropriate and we should rely on more of objective type of data rather than subjective data. Then data management. Like for example, if we have done a blinding study and we should be vigilant about the unblinding of the patients. For example, there was a study in which the authors had published an article with the data and the groups with reverse coded variables. Now, for example, if in that paper A group is found to be significantly better as compared to a B group, but because they have reversed the coded variables, so the interpretation is exactly the opposite. So they have to write to the editor after the publication of the paper that the results are exactly the opposite. So data management should also be quite robust while doing the analysis. Then statistical analysis error, which I will talk about in my presentation. Then there can be an error with regard to logic. For example, this is most common in observational studies like cross-sectional studies or retrospective studies. Like we used to observe a correlation between two variables. And because, for example, I did a study on the prevalence of metabolic syndrome in psoriasis patients. And I found that in psoriasis patients, there is high prevalence of metabolic syndrome as compared to the normal population. But from this correlation or higher prevalence of metabolic syndrome in psoriasis patient, I can't make a judgment of association that metabolic syndrome is associated with psoriasis, because that type of association or that type of assumptions are basically wrong. So these type of logical errors usually occurs with observational studies, and we should be vigilant while reviewing the paper with regard to these type of logics which authors usually come up in their papers. Then lastly, there can be a communication errors which you are all aware of, like most of the negative studies are not published and many of the authors do self-citation, so citation bias can be there. So because negative studies are not published, mostly positive result studies are usually published, so then there can be a publication bias. So while conducting a meta-analysis, we should be able to check whether there is any publication bias or not. Now coming to the topic of the crux of the today's topic, like what can be the errors with regard to statistical analysis. So what to review within a paper with regard to statistics. So we should be vigilant about that the paper, whether the paper or whether the study has an adequate control group or not. Many of the studies may have the absence of adequate control condition or group. Then there can be other errors like interpreting comparison between two effects without directly comparing them. Then there can be another error like inflating the unit of analysis. So, and there can be spurious correlation which can be interpreted. Use of small sample size. What happens with the use of small sample size? Like small sample sizes are usually not normally distributed, and because of small sample size, it is most probably that we are able to miss the actual effect in that is present in a study, and chances of doing a type 1 error also increases with when we use a small sample size in our studies. Then there can be circular analysis problem or double dipping. Double dipping is mainly, or circular analysis is mainly a problem with regard to neuroimaging studies, when we do a multiple analysis which are not independent from each other. Like for example, if we select a data and try to do a multiple analysis, and we are like, for example, in an observational study, if we do in a study design of 2 by 3 by 3 study design, if we do an analysis, there is a 30% chance that we will come across a association of significant results in that analysis. So this type of error is basically a circular analysis error, which can be prevented by doing the correction for alpha error. So all these can be the statistical errors in a paper, which I will try to cover in my coming slides. First of all, I will cover the absence of adequate control group or control condition in a study. For example, I will take a recent example of remdesivir. There are 2 studies which are published in NEJM, Goldman et al. And Green et al. Green et al. Is a compassionate use of remdesivir in a COVID-19 patients, and both the studies have found that their remdesivir for 5 days as well as 10 days has effectively caused a decrease in the duration of the symptoms in patients suffering from severe COVID-19. But the main part is that both the studies have no control group, but they have concluded that remdesivir decreased the duration of the symptoms by significantly in patients suffering from COVID-19. And US FDA has given the approval for the treatment of COVID-19 with remdesivir. Now we see that there is a news sometimes back in India that 90% of the COVID-19 patients who got fake remdesivir also survived. Okay? So studies with control group shows no mortality benefit. Now there is another meta-analysis done by Dr. Ankita Chugh. Dr. Ankita Chugh, you all must know. She has done a presentation on initial presentation, like what editors look into your paper. Her meta-analysis has shown that there is no mortality benefit with use of remdesivir. So this is a meta-analysis plot, and you can see that remdesivir and with regard to control in low risk, in high risk, and in all the patients, if we see that remdesivir is found to have similar mortality as compared to control group. So it has found, so we came to conclusion that remdesivir gave no mortality benefit, hence not recommended, taking into the cost consideration that remdesivir cost is also very high. A patient, you have to spend around 30,000 rupees for a 5 days of remdesivir. So you should be vigilant in watching for absence of control group. So when we take into consideration the control group, we found that there is no mortality benefit. That is why now remdesivir has been not included in the treatment of COVID-19 in AIIMS Delhi guidelines. So you should be very vigilant with regard to this type of error. Then another type of error which I talked about in my present first slide is that interpreting comparison between two facts without directly comparing them. For example, if you see a correlation of group A and group B, you will see that group A has a significant correlation. That group A data has a significant correlation, p-value is equal to 0.035. But group B data correlation is not significant. So from here, we can't conclude that group A is significantly different from group B, because when we plot the group A and group B data together, we see that the group A has similar correlation as compared to group B. So we can't we should not conclude something when we are not comparing them. So group A should be compared with group B, when only then we can interpret the data of group A comparison with group B. Then another example is of numerical data. For example, if we see that there is a group C and a group D, and group C has shown that for example, if there is a disease in groups C and group D, and there is a significant improvement in that disease symptom score in group C, as p-value is equal to 0.034. But group D, there is no significant improvement in that group of patients with the treatment. Okay? So, but we can't conclude that group C is significantly better as compared to group D. We can't conclude this until unless we did a comparison of group C versus group D. So when we compare a group C versus group D, we found that p-value is equal to 0.9, which is non-significant. So we can only conclude by directly comparing them. We can't make conclusion on intra-group comparison. We have to do an inter-group comparison for making a conclusion for intergroup. I hope that you will be able to understand what I'm trying to tell with with my presentation. Then coming to spurious correlations. See in this graph, I'm trying to show you that there are like one set of data, and in DEF there are two sets of data, two subgroup data. In this there is one set of data, and there is one outlier. And if you can see, if the distance between this outlier and the rest of the data increases, the correlation value will increase significantly. For example, here the correlation value is -0.14. It increases to 0.26, and it increases to 0.54 when this outlier distance between this outlier and the rest of the data increases. So this type of correlation can be a spurious correlation. So we should be very vigilant with regard to interpreting these type of correlations. And when interpreting this type of correlation, if we came across these type of correlations, we should write back to the authors that you should try to omit this outlier and then try to analyze that. Okay. Now coming to this example, for example, author try to correlate between two groups. So if the two groups data, two subgroup data is randomly distributed close to each other, there is no correlation. But if you see the distance between the two subgroups increases, like for example, if there is if the numerical data between the two subgroups is significantly different, then it is bound to increase the correlation between the two. For example, here you see the correlation is -0.28. Here the correlation increases, and here the correlation is very significant. So again, the interpretation in these type of in this type of correlations is to be taken with great caution. This is basically a spurious correlation, and it can be taken care by consulting a statistician or by asking the authors to do a stringent correlation by using a stringent correlation methods like bootstrapping or script correlation methods. So by using those methods, we can get a good correlation, and we will try to omit the spurious correlation which we can get in a data. Then coming to use of small samples. See, what is the problem with the small samples? Small samples are usually not normally distributed, so they are bound to give us sometimes significant results. Sometimes they can give us a significant results, and most of the times, as the power is inadequate in small samples, we are more likely to miss an effect. For example, large sample size can detect even the tiny effects. So there was a study done of like fake data only. The sample size was 3000 and difference in the mean score of was 0.1, and the p-value is less than 0.001. And in another subgroup study, sample size was 3, difference of in mean scores of two groups was 3, and p-value is greater than 0.10. So if sample size is small, we can miss a actual effect, and if sample size is very large, even then we can even detect a very tiny effect like vast score of difference of 0.1. Okay, so with this you should be cautious, like if in a large sample size, p-value of less than 0.001 can give you a significant result, but you should be vigilant whether those difference or those change in vast score or those change in the scores are clinically significant also or not. For example, here the values are statistically significant, but vast score is not clinically significant. Okay, so you should take into consideration both statistical significant as well as clinically significant difference while interpreting the results. I hope you should be clear. You should have. Well, I am making my points clear to the audience. And then with regard to the type 1 error, so small sample size usually can increase the chances of type 1 error. Type 1 error is error like there is an effect when in reality there is no effect. For example, the type 1 error chances are high because with regard to small samples. This is because as only large effects are detected by small sample size. Because हमारा sample size छोटा है, तो अगर defect जो difference between groups है, अगर large होगा तो ही detect होगा. As you have seen in this example, sample size 3 था and difference of vast scores was 3. So we are not able to detect the difference. P-value was non-significant. For example, the difference in two groups vast score is 20 and sample size is small, and we get a p-values which is significant. So we are able to detect a large effect. But main fallacy here is that people think that large effect detected are always true. This is the main fallacy. This is not always the case. So even the large effect which are detected may be a wrong effect which can be by chance, or it may be because that there are possibility of detecting a initial excursions in the true effect. For example, I tried a study with fixed samples design, and see this dotted line is a true effect level. So this dotted line is a true effect level, and this is a hazard ratio which is 1. So this is hazard ratio in negative will show that the treatment has given benefit to the participants or patients. Now in initial stages, like when the sample size is small, the results can move in either direction. For example, I stopped the study or I did an interim analysis at this stage. Okay, so I will find that treatment A is significantly better than treatment B. For example, again I did an interim analysis at this place. I again find out that A is better than B. then I did a tandem analysis at this place. I again find that A is better than B. But as the time increases and as the sample size increase, my effect will actually move towards the true effect level. So adequate sample size is very important in rejecting the null hypothesis. So increasing the power should be adequate. So you should be very vigilant with regard to studies which report positive effect or positive treatment effect with small sample size. Now coming to the inflating the unit of analysis. Now with regard to inflating the unit of analysis, it is like quite difficult to understand, but I am trying to give you a simple example of cluster sampling. For example, in cluster sampling, what happens? This is usually done in epidemiological studies. For example, you try to do a study on the prevalence of fluorosis in community. So, for example, a village is taking water from a particular well. So, all the village people have high chances of getting fluorosis. So, if you try to find a difference between that cluster, it is difficult to get. So unit of analysis, for example, I try to find the prevalence of fluorosis in Western Rajasthan. So I have to take a whole village as a cluster, and then unit of analysis of my study will be a cluster in comparison to other clusters. I can't then use the single patient data as a unit of analysis. If I do single patient data as a unit of analysis, my whole interpretation and my whole sample size calculation will go wrong. So this is one of the simplest example of telling you how to do how to prevent that, how to do unit of analysis and how to prevent that inflating unit of analysis error. Then another some type of errors which can be there in the paper is the flexibility of analysis or p-hacking. Many people do p-hacking, and we should be vigilant about this p-hacking and how people do. I will try to explain you in upcoming slides. Then failing to correct for a multiple comparison. Persons usually do a multiple comparison in the study and then try to report only the significant comparison to the paper in paper. So that will give us the spurious results. So we should be vigilant about these also, and how to avoid that. There are many methods to avoid that. We have to compensate for the alpha, like we have to increase the alpha error so that we can adjust for the multiple comparison that they have done. Then over interpreting the non-significant results. Sometimes people do over interpretation of non-significant results. How they do? Like for example, we got a non-significant result with a particular drug, like for example, hydroxychloroquine in COVID-19. We found that hydroxychloroquine is not effective in COVID-19. So this might be because of many reasons. It is not that the hydroxychloroquine is not effective only. That is why we got a non-significant result. It might be a possibility that our design, our power or our sample size used in that particular study is small. It might be a possibility of that because of small sample size or decreased power, that we are not able to get the significant result. For example, this has happened actually in COVID-19. Prednisone was not found initially to be of benefit in COVID-19, but solidarity trial done by WHO, which recruited around 3,500 or 4,000 patients in each group, has found that prednisolone or corticosteroids are found to be effective in reducing the mortality in COVID-19. So over-interpretation of non-significant results should also be avoided. Then there is another example of this non-significant results. For example, I tell you a real scenario. Like for example, there is a ischemic stroke patients. The ischemic stroke patients, why they suffer from ischemic stroke? there is a clot in the cerebral vessel, because of which the patient suffer from ischemic stroke. So as MI patients usually get, myocardial infarction patients usually get streptokinase for the treatment. So ischemic stroke trial was done with the use of streptokinase in ischemic stroke patient. So they did a study and they find out that streptokinase was not found to be effective in ischemic stroke patients. Now, because of non-significant result, nobody was trying another class of thrombolytic agent in ischemic stroke patients. But then a pharmaceutical company come up with a trial in which they use recombinant tissue plasminogen activator and try to use that drug in a ischemic stroke patients and use a different assessment scale for the improvement in the patients of stroke. And at the end of the study, they found out that recombinant tissue plasminogen activator was found to be effective in improving the survival of the patients of ischemic stroke patients. So by improving the study design, by improving the assessment scores, they are able to find a drug which is found to be effective. So you should be very vigilant while over interpreting a non-significant results. Then correlation and causation. So if you find a correlation between two things, you should not always interpret it as a causation, even if such an association is plausible. I will tell you about all these with examples. What is p-hacking and p-dragging? First of all, we will try to see p-hacking, what is p-hacking and how it happens. Like for example, this is a graph. This is the graph of this red ones are the letter in winning words of Scripps National Spelling Bee. It correlates with the number of people killed with venomous spiders in US. So if you see that these two are not related to each other. Okay, even then the people has found a correlation between these two non correlated things. So it is a highly chance that by random error we can find a correlation between two things. So this is a type of p-hacking which can occur in real scenario. For example, like I did not find a significant association between two groups, so I will further try to subgroup the data. Then I found that there is the p-value between the two groups increases. Then even then I try to subgroup the data, so that at the end I find out two groups which are significantly different from each other. This is the p-hacking which is usually done in the papers. So see, this is a multiple comparison done between two drugs, and the author has reported only a significant result data. So this is the type of p-hacking which is usually done. So how we can do a p-hacking and how it actually happens is clear in this slide. For example, in a viral disease or in a COVID disease patients, the usual time of recovery varies from 5 days and 15 days. Then we are trying to assess the difference between two drugs, A and B, and we see that there is no significant difference between the two drugs. Then at the end of the at one analysis, we find that drug A is significantly better as compared to drug B. So why this happens? This happens because drug A has a patients who has recovery within 5 days, and drug B got the patients whose natural ability to recover from viral disease is 15 days. Actually, we compare the two different set of population in two treatment groups. Actually, the drugs are not effective, but we have compared the actual two different set of population. That is why we got significant results. This is the p-hacking done in usually papers. So there can be many methods by which we can do p-hacking, like stop collecting data once that we get a significant result, analyze many measures but report only those which have significant results, use covariates to get the p significant exclude participants to get the significant results, exclude the outliers, and transform the data to get significant p-value. So this is not should be done in a paper. For example, then there can be a chances of error with multiple comparison. What happens in multiple comparison? Multiple comparisons can lead to p-hacking also, but multiple comparisons also increases the likelihood of doing a random error. So when you do a multiple comparisons, the probability of type 1 error increases. So as the probability of type 1 error increases, the chances of getting a significant result also increases. So when we do a multiple comparison, we should do a correction for increased type 1 error. For example, if we do five multiple comparisons, then our alpha chances of alpha error increases by 5 times. 5 25. 5 into 5 is 25. So our chances of doing a type 1 error is 25%. So we have to do a correction for that increase alpha error. So you should be vigilant that the persons who have done multiple comparison, they try to do the Bonferroni corrections or alpha corrections. Okay. For example, if they had done a 5 comparison and they have reported a p-value of less than 0.05 as significant, then it should not be interpreted as significant. New p-value should be 0.01 divided by 5, which is equal to p is equal to 0.002. So only the results which are reporting as p value less than 0.002 should be considered as significance. Otherwise, they should be considered as non-significant. So multiple comparison correction should always be done in a paper, which can be easily done by Bonferroni correction. And there can be other methods which can be used for alpha compensation or alpha correction can also be done by other methods. You can consult a statistician with regard to that. Then lastly, there can be a correlation and causation. See, for example, if you see if something runs out of battery, then video player won't work. Okay? Also, computer shutdowns. So computer shutdown is correlated with video player won't work, but they are not causation of each other. Okay, because battery is a causation for computer shutdown, as well as battery runoff. Absence of battery is also a causation for video player not working properly. Okay, but both of these things are correlated with each other, but causation, they are not causing each other. Actually, absence of battery is the causation of these computer shutdown and or not working of video player. So whenever we are reporting correlations in cross-sectional studies and observational studies, we should make sure that author should not conclude causation or conclude associations between the two correlated variables. Like for example, on sunny days, I eat more ice cream and I got sunburn. So I can't correlate that eating ice cream can get me sunburn. Actually, sun is causing me sunburn. Okay. So if you are asking majority of sunburn people who are went to a beach, they will say, yeah, I have higher intake of ice cream. Then you will conclude that higher intake of ice cream can give sunburns. No, they are correlated, but they are not. Well, ice cream is not a causative factor for sunburns. So you should be like very vigilant with regard to all these statistical errors which I try to talk about. And why should we be vigilant with regard to this statistical error? This is my last slide only. So one of the important consequences which have happened in history is like you should have all be aware of sudden infant death syndrome. It has been reported in 1800s and 1900s, and thymus irradiation. It has been found that all the patients all the children who died of sudden infant death syndrome were they were autopsied, and they find out that thymus is large in those babies who died of sudden infant death syndrome. So they try to take out the thymus at an early stage in most of the infants, but they found out that thymus removal is associated with increased mortality. So then there come up a treatment, thymus irradiation. So thymus irradiation became the treatment of choice in early 1900s for sudden infant death syndromes. So most of the European countries and American people and Canadian people, what they do, they give thymus irradiation to their children so that there will be less chances of sudden infant death syndrome in those patients. So poor reasoning and data collection resulted in radiation treatment of children to prevent sudden infant death syndrome in early 1900s, resulting in greater than 10,000 babies dying of thyroid cancer. So this is a blunder we did in history because of wrong interpretation of data. So I pose you a question with regard to this, like what actual error would have been there because of which thymus irradiation has become the treatment of choice. So what do you think can be the error or mistake in the studies which was done by the authors or the scientific community, which has led to the so much higher number of patients dying of thyroid cancer? So any of you can try to analyze the data or analyze the error in this. So I hope everyone is mute, so I will tell you, I myself tell you the error. Actually what happened, similar to Hinduism and Sikhism and other our religion, the people in the West, they are Christians, most of them are Christians, and they are very rigid in their beliefs. Like for example, if we do biopsy or autopsy of a dead patient, of a dead children, then it might be a possibility that in their after death life they may not have their vital organs with them. So it is very essential to have vital organs in after death life. So Christian people also doesn't want their babies to be autopsied. Only autopsy which was done in the dead children were of the children of poor community or the peasants who are working in the fields. So the poor children thymus was found to be smaller in size because of malnutrition. And these people compare the sudden infant death syndrome, which was reported in higher income group children, and compare that thymus with the thymus of autopsies children who died from some other causes and but also have malnutrition. So the difference in the size of the thymus will be there. So they have used a historical control for comparison of the thymus, and they have wrongly interpreted that size of the thymus is large in patients who died of SIDS, and that is why they came up with the thymus irradiation as the treatment of choice for patients who died of SIDS. And this, because of this, we did a scientific blunder in our history. So statistical analysis and whole of the data analysis is very essential while reporting a paper, as perceived by me and many of the statisticians. And my references for the presentation is from this, and some of the references are myself only. I make my presentation from scratch only, but most of the points are taken from this reference. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Surjit, for such a wonderful presentation, for making touching the hard topic in such a lighter note. So there are a couple of questions. Just I'll take one of the question is for you and Dr. Divya both. And the question is that most of the papers simply mention the number of sample enrolled in the study. Any justification needed for sampling methodology or sample size calculation? What are the views of as editor?
Neeraj, I think we'll take the questions in the WhatsApp group. I have
That's-
another meeting and we need to end this.
Okay, I'll,
thank you.
with,
Sorry
with
about
this
that.
note, I just convey once again sincere thanks from all the team to Dr. Sujit. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sujit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.